Hello and welcome to Sweetwater. I'm Mason Marangella from Vertex Effects. With me is the fabulous Ford Thurston.
What's up?
Today we're going to be playing the Vertex battery power supply. Now many of you may have heard from players like Eric Johnson and others that batteries inherently have a different sound than a power supply. So we've actually created a product that addresses this and makes it easy for guitar players to try this out on their effects to see where there are differences and perhaps utilize a 9-volt carbon battery instead of a power supply on select pedals, primarily overdrive, distortion, wah, and fuzz. Today, I've brought 3 examples of pedals that happen to be sensitive to the difference between a battery and a 9-volt supply. I have a vintage Prescription Electronics Experience fuzz, I have a Centaur, and I have a TS9 from the 80s. But this could easily just be a current day TS9. Now, for our power supply, I have one of my favorite isolated power supplies on the market, which is the Chalks 4. And on the other side here, I have our Vertex battery power supply. And if I open up the power supply, you'll in fact see that there are 4 9-volt batteries sitting right inside of the power supply, and each one of these batteries feeds one pedal individually. Now, I do have one extra one here because I'm only using 3 pedals, so this 4th one isn't being used, but all the other ones are being powered by batteries. Now, I've built something a little custom because I knew I was coming to Sweetwater and I wanted to be able to give you a good example of the differences. So I also built this custom box, which has a toggle switch in the middle, which corresponds to the switches in the right being dedicated to the supply, being what's powering these 3 pedals. And then if I were to switch them to the left, it's the batteries that are providing power to these 3 pedals. So you can see in real time, I'll go back and forth, and you get to see some of the nuances that the batteries provide that the supply cannot. So what are the actual difference, as science and physics would tell us, about carbon batteries versus a supply, or even differences between different types of batteries, alkaline versus carbon, like what we're using today? So carbon is the least efficient of all the possible ways to power your pedals. However, it being really inefficient is what makes the sound great. It's a high impedance source, and there's this constant interplay that occurs within the pedals between the voltage dropping and current limiting, doing this tug-of-war inside of your pedal, which actually makes it react much more akin to what happens when you have a transformer, like a power transformer that's about to buckle, as you hit it really hard with a power cord, and then it kind of regenerates back to its original state. A very similar exchange is happening inside the pedals with the way that they're powered by a 9-volt battery versus a supply. The supply, by contrast, is providing a constant voltage all the time. If it's 9 volts, it remains 9 volts in perpetuity, infinitely the entire time that it's feeding the pedal. There isn't any variability between the voltage or the current that it's providing to the pedal. If you're using an alkaline battery, it actually much more closely resembles what a power supply would. The voltage pretty much stays at 9 volts the entirety of its life, and at the very end, it starts to drop off, whereas a carbon is dying from the moment that it's beginning to be used. And if you looked at a graph, you would pretty much see a steady decline from the moment that the battery is used to when it ends its life at whatever the lowest operating voltage is that these pedals can reasonably run at. After that point, it reaches that threshold, it's not going to work anymore. And it's a pretty sharp decline right from the moment that it's in use. Now, you may say to yourself, well, I have a power supply already that has a sag control, and isn't that just emulating a battery? Well, it's emulating a part of what a battery does. As I mentioned earlier, there's this interplay between voltage and current that's happening in a high impedance source like a carbon battery. And although some power supplies have made some great strides in being able to emulate the battery, all they're doing is lowering the voltage, but it's still linear and static at a certain voltage. It's not fluctuating in real time like a carbon battery would, nor is it doing any sort of current restriction. So although it's taking some of the steps in order to emulate a carbon battery, it's really only replicating a part of the equation, and it's not doing the variable voltage, nor is it doing current limiting like the batteries that we're using today. And just so you know, the carbon battery is the cheapest battery you can buy. At any dollar store, you can often buy 4 carbon batteries, which would provide all of these outputs with the power needed for $1 or less. So very inexpensive. If you do want to try this out, easy to get these at any dollar store near you. Enough of me talking though, let's actually hear how it sounds. Ford's going to be playing through these 3 pedals, the Experience Fuzz, the Centaur, and the Tube Screamer, and I'm going to be toggling back and forth between the power supply and the battery in real time so you can see what these differences are and whether these subtleties are something that you want to invest in to really optimize your overdrive, distortion, fuzz, and wah style pedals.
I can totally feel a difference. Crazy.
One thing that I noticed right off the bat is there's actually a noise floor difference. Can you just turn on your guitar and mute your strings real quick? So here's the battery. There's some noise because it's a fuzz, but let's go to the supply.
That white noise, I hear the like an amp on 10.
The white noise comes back. And so when we talk about isolated supplies, the battery is actually the most isolated supply. It has no reference to the AC mains. It's its own integrated supply, completely separate from everything else. So it already is quiet if you have some noisier vintage effects like a fuzz already.
Yeah.
We've solved one problem in terms of the noise in addition to the sound. Let's move over now to the Klon style, and I'll do the exact same thing, repeating, going back and forth between the supply and the battery. What are you hearing here?
I feel like the battery has a softer top end. It's like an umbrella over the note. I feel like that the low end's just different, but the top's smoother. The regular power from the wall has more of a point to the top of the note.
One thing you would notice if we were to connect...
It's a rectifier from an amplifier going, just ducking a little bit.
Interesting.
Yeah.
If I were to connect actually a meter to my batteries and read these in real time, if you actually dig in really hard on a carbon battery on a lot of circuits, you'll actually see the voltage go down and then regenerate. Let's see what happens if you kind of hit some hard kind of sustaining notes with this. I'll give you a little more gain. And let's see what this does. Let's go back to the supply first.
Dark, go ahead. Same thing, I can hear it clear as night and day.
Let's repeat this now with the Tube Screamer and see what we got.
Sharp. Yeah, just a roundness, it's cool.
How about some rhythm stuff with this? I'll continue this.
Okay, so. Brighter on the wall power.
Yeah, definitely when it goes to the power supply, you can hear sort of this EQ boost, elevated high-end notes. And we're not necessarily saying that this is better or worse. Of course, this is a subjective thing that you may like this extra clarity, but the battery certainly sags it and browns it out quite a bit.
Yeah, that's it right there. Yeah, it's like you're putting a variac on it.
Almost, yeah.
I'm gonna bend notes into the C. Can you do that same thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, right, like when I was, there it is. Now it's on the wall and it's bright.
Yeah. Yeah.
Weird. I mean, not only that, but I really feel it a lot too.
Yeah, and that's one thing obviously we can't translate as well through the video. There's like a bounce to it. And I mentioned earlier, I kind of invoked the idea of a power transformer, and there is a certain sort of like breathing quality that those have when you really dig into them. You can really feel that bounce under your fingers. And even within different types of carbon batteries here, there's even variability between
The Eric
them.
Johnson thing.
Yeah, the Eric Johnson.
Hearing the difference. I'll tell you what, that definitely wasn't smoke, because you can feel it and hear it, and when you touch the notes, you can feel like a sweetness that's not there with wall power.
Absolutely. And I want to make it clear that this is not going to be something that's going to work for every type of pedal. Primarily what you're looking for is vintage style, not necessarily vintage in themselves, but vintage style overdrives, fuzzes, distortions, wahs. For something that needs to be real linear and clean, this is not going to be a benefit for that. So how can you tell if a pedal's going to be sensitive to a battery or the power supply? The easiest way to tell is actually turn your pedal on and unplug the power from it. If the LED stays illuminated for a long time before it goes dim, that means that it has a large power supply cap on there, and there's probably not going to be any difference between the battery versus the supply because that cap is holding that charge. It's not going to have as much variability. But if you unplug from it and the LED goes dead right away, that could mean that there's no power supply cap or a very low value power supply cap, which means that there's going to be a greater variability between what the supply is going to sound like versus the carbon battery. So that might be a good litmus test for you to use at home if you're considering which pedals you might want to use on the carbon batteries. One other feature that I should mention before we conclude today is that I actually added a switch to this power supply, which you can use this supply independently of any wall power. So as you can see over on the battery power supply, we do have an input that's being fed from the CHOX 4, and you can see the BPSU, which stands for battery power supply, which is sending a feed to the power input. Now what this input is doing is it's telling the relays when they need to activate the batteries versus when they need to turn them off. But for some people, they may not be using the battery power supply in conjunction with another supply for their other pedals, their delays, their reverbs, their modulation, etc. You can actually use the battery power supply as its own power supply. If I just simply move the toggle over, I can unplug the input from it. You're going to see this LED go off, but now we're just using these batteries as their own standalone power supply, and the pedals will still turn on and off as they did before. We don't lose any power at all. So if you did need to have a travel rig or just something for a satellite gig and you needed to have a small power supply and you didn't need any wall power, you could actually just use this and it could power your distortion pedals, your overdrive pedals, your fuzzes. Any of your low current stuff would work just fine in this particular setting. And of course, if you have a larger power supply and you want to use this as just an auxiliary power supply, you can just flip the switch back, plug in your input power, and you're going to be ready to go just like you were before. Another thing about the power supply input is it has the advantage of allowing you to not use your batteries when the entire board is turned off. You don't have any need anymore to unplug the input of your pedal or do anything different than you would do when you unplug your pedal board normally. It turns off the batteries and they're not in use whenever the entire board is off. So that's one big benefit of using the battery power supply in conjunction with another supply. Once you turn the board off, everything is turned off. The batteries are not going to be drained at all by the pedals as they ordinarily would if they were housed inside of the pedals themselves. And you can change your batteries in less than 30 seconds on 4 pedals. You don't need to adjust anything on your pedal board. So a real advantage if this is something you're considering for your rig. So that was the Vertex battery power supply. As you heard today, there is a difference between the carbon batteries and the supply. And guys like Eric Johnson, who have been touting the benefits of batteries from the rooftops for years, we can see that he wasn't telling a lie. So if you want to check this out, definitely talk to your Sweetwater sales engineer, and they can give you the lowdown on this, even beyond some of the stuff that we talked about in the video today. So definitely talk to them about that. I also highly recommend that you like, subscribe, and leave us a comment here. And you want to do that just so you can stay up to date on all the great stuff that's coming out from Sweetwater all the time. Great benefit and information and all the types of stuff that they're doing here. Until next time, I'm Mason Marangella from Vertex Effects. Ford Thurston, will you play us a little something to complete?